All right. I'm not sure where they're getting this number from. If they're talking uranium-233 versus uranium-235, it's a little more, but...
Despite all of this, molten salt reactors have largely been stuck in the experimental phase for decades.
So why aren't we working on liquid fuel in the United States in general?
Oh, licensing. Licensing a liquid fuel reactor, commercial especially, in the US right now is scary.
There's a lot of regulatory hurdles with new technology. And part of it is it just doesn't have the industry maturity. So it's the second mover bias. More like fourth or fifth.
Nuclear status quo remained unchallenged, not even after countless reactor meltdowns. No one's made any moves to put the molten...
Countless reactor meltdowns, come on. Also, this looks like an explosion at... Also, this isn't a nuclear plant. The significant ones that involved melting that involved energy production reactions were 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. Were there others? Yes. There were others that happened in the experimental stage, but not countless. I had a class where we studied every single nuclear accident. It's one of the things that's required to get your license when operating a nuclear power plant in the United States. The class was a little over an hour, and it included criticality accidents in addition, which didn't involve anything melting.
Salt reactor theory into practice, until now. Over in China, Xu and his team developed the reactor technology from American declassified research of the 1960s. The US was testing this very same technology, but chose not to develop it further. Instead, they focused on uranium-fueled pressurized water reactor technology. That 1960s research...
In that time period, your goal was, let's make some electricity, but let's also make some weapons. And in the thorium stream, the slightly less proliferation is seen as a disadvantage back then.
Was known as Oak Ridge. It was the closest America came to thorium power. But why did they stop? We'll look into that now.
To make things that blow
NRC
up.
regulations specifically spell out prohibitions against fluid-filled reactors. You cannot operate fluid-filled reactor more than 1 megawatt without expensive license process.
After the Hiroshima bomb tipped the scales of power in America's favor, the US was keen to develop more nuclear weapons. Much of that work happened at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. Director Alvin Weinberg also began looking into alternative, less weaponizable nuclear methods. Thorium-fueled molten salt reactors were what he settled on. The molten salt reactor experiment ran from 1965 to 1969. The results were incredibly promising. It quickly became the holy grail of thorium research. As the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists states, quote, "All molten salt reactors are based in one way or another on the molten salt reactor experiment that operated at Oak Ridge from 1965 to 1969. End quote.
Build off existing technology, why not?
Following the vision of Alvin Weinberg, he was the director of Oak Ridge National Labs from the 50s to the 1970s, and he had a vision of how we could use thorium to advance beyond the current constraints of our society in terms of fossil fuels, hydropower, and existing nuclear technology. One of the amazing parts about his vision was how this could transform not only the US economy, but many other places in the world, some of which don't have the resources that we have in terms of fresh water or arable land. This is a vision he had of how thorium reactors could be used to desalinate water, grow crops in desert areas.
Oh, so I didn't realize he even looked at the extracting thorium from seawater portion if he's talking about that part of ocean. That's interesting.
Really, truly change the economic balance of the world.
But then, the experiment was shut down. In his book, Alvin Weinberg questioned, quote, "Why didn't the molten salt system, so elegant and so well thought out, prevail? There were no technical reasons why the molten salt reactor was not pursued." End quote. For one.
So putting aside the political Cold War, let's make weapons too argument, there were still some engineering channels that remained unsolved. Fuel separation, the Protactinium-233, doing that in real time was still more challenging. Corrosion control using liquid high-temp salts going to degrade over time. Graphite moderation, which they had back then, also degrades. And everything being radioactive liquid, 600 plus Celsius, maintenance is a problem. They didn't have the remote handling tech, the radiation hardened materials, and off-gas cleaning systems, and there was no large-scale industrial roadmap to back that up. So it wasn't all bombs, but that was some of them.
During the Cold War, uranium fever was at an all-time high. The Pentagon needed faster breeder reactors that could fuel the nuclear arms race. In short, nobody cared that thorium was safer.
So those aren't really breeder in the sense of where you're breeding your own fuel. It's more of you're making plutonium to make weapons at the same time.
Or that it wasn't suitable for weaponry. That somewhat defeated the point.
Weinberg's vision, on the other hand, was brought to an end in the early 1970s. And I think this was a very sad moment in the history of our country and probably in the history of the world, because an entire direction.
Yeah, because we could have invested in that stuff back then and it still would have been technology that wasn't there in the 1970s, but it probably could have been here by now with investment in the required support systems using liquid metal technology.
Of potential development was being ended at that moment by a not well thought out comment by Congressman Holyfield, who was very powerful. So Weinberg's pursuit of thorium appears to have had a great deal to do with why he was fired from his position.
Coming back with what will be built, again, it's light water reactors. I don't understand what's going on here. Why are we spending money to build reactors based on the same concept that we have been building ever since World War II?
It wasn't all about politics, though. According to Alvin, in the 1950s and 60s, nuclear power was dominated by physicists who thought in terms of solid fuel pins, reactor physics, and neutron behavior. All the while, the key to safer nuclear power lay in chemistry. Quote,
so, I can't speak for what people thought in, like, physicists and universities back then, but everyone, at least from before I went to college to after that, are talking about the same sort of thorium technology all the time. Differences in different fuel types, different reactor types, but just not being there. And with fusion as well. It's actually kind of sad the more I think about it. One of the reasons why I didn't get into research, I wanted to get into operations.
our problem is not that the idea is poor, it's that it's different from the mainstream and too chemical to be fully appreciated by non-chemists. End quote.
You can teach it,
We'll
though.
look at the
I mean, these are nuclear engineers we're talking about. Chemistry is really part of it.
Points to what Alvin is saying in the last section of this episode. But for now, let's see what happens next.
That's a shame.
So, the Oak Ridge experiment was defunded, Alvin was reassigned, and the thorium blueprints gathered dust. That was until the 2000s. At that time, NASA engineer Kirk Sorensen was researching ways to power a community on the moon. Kirk stumbled across Oak Ridge's research on molten salt reactors and thorium, and he was mesmerized by thorium's energy density. It was so high that you could theoretically hold a lifetime's worth of energy in your hand, and it was abundant on both the Earth and on...
You can do that with uranium too, depending on what you mean by lifetime, like all you would need to power your household. But yeah, I just still look back and mesmerize with nuclear energy in general is ultra energy dense.
The moon. Kirk got to work to get the message out about thorium. He was convinced that if the United States hadn't abandoned thorium research, the country could have been energy independent by the early 2000s. But alas, his thorium enthusiasm fell on deaf ears. But here, the story takes a major turn. While
That would also involve mass electric car usage if you're including that.
seemingly everyone was ignoring what he had to say, one country did notice the potential. China. There were thousands of reports sitting there in public archives with insights that could shape the next generation of energy, and the Chinese researchers realized that a thorium-fueled molten salt reactor could solve their growing energy needs, and also secure their national interests. In 2009, China's thorium
Keep in mind that those images they showed was a typical refueling cavity using water. None of that was molten salt.
project formally took shape. Construction began in 2018. There were hundreds of scientists who worked day and night for years, dissecting declassified American documents.
They're showing pictures of a reactor that uses water.
Replicating experiments and designing new materials. and many of them were on site for more than 300 days per year. Project lead Zhu would summarize the situation by saying, quote, "Rabbits sometimes make mistakes and grow lazy. That's when the tortoise seizes its chance."
Wow.
And seized the chance they did. In 2023, China's
just in
thorium
terms of
molten salt
yeah.
reactor achieved a sustained nuclear chain reaction, and by June of 2024, the reactor was operational.
It's amazing. So 60-year time skip, and they're just at roughly similar levels as Oak Ridge. I'd say still a few years behind because of how long that one operated. All right, here's hype.
And now
from
we come to the
reality.
reality check. We may be closer than ever before to a thorium-powered future, but there are still many things to consider.
I would argue we were closer in the 1960s before it was shut down hard.
Contrary to popular belief, there have been a number of commercial thorium plants in the past, and that's since the late 40s in Germany, India, the Netherlands, and the US. But none of them survived past the 1980s. Well, why is that? Some plants did have design problems, but there's more to it. It turns out that the process of extracting thorium from ore and converting it into a fertile fuel for nuclear purposes was a lot more expensive than doing the same thing for uranium. The pessimist view is that economics killed thorium, and nothing else. As mentioned,
Not nothing else, but yeah.
thorium
I can
can
see that
produce
argument.
200 times the energy of the equivalent uranium.
No, it can't. I don't know where they're getting that number from. Best I can guess is the relative abundance of thorium-232 numbers versus the natural abundance of uranium-235 sitting with uranium-238. So you're assuming you get 100% out of your thorium-232 conversion into uranium-233. Total fuel utilization. That's gotta be what they think they're getting from that. No. It's similar energy per fission, and thorium has to be breeded to uranium-233. I don't know what those exact numbers are, but it's not the 200.
But this requires the reprocessing of the fuel. You can't just run the plant and burn up all the thorium. And that's because as the plant would keep running, at some point, the accumulation of waste products affects the operation of a thorium core. And as you
It's
guessed,
possible to design it where you can refuel it online, but ultimately you need to shut the plant down anyway. Because you're going to have to do maintenance on the non-nuclear systems, the steam turbine, the part that makes the electricity. You need to take generators, feed water heaters offline and replace them every now and then.
to keep this up and keep the plant running long term is expensive. And another clarification, a lot of
Outages are going to be longer. It's possible they'll be less frequent than 18 to 24 months, but they're going to be longer.
people do say that the reason that thorium hasn't caught on was that it can't be used for weapons. But it's more along the lines that it's more expensive to use it as a weapon, which is a good thing in the end, I guess. And then there's the problem of materials science. For molten salt reactors,
That wasn't a bad debunker D-hop on their part.
the salt is extremely hot and ends up being corrosive to its surroundings. Materials that can survive this long term are hard to come by, but the Chinese seem to be working on the issue. They've built a custom alloy called Hasteloy N. So let's say that thorium can do what the thorium proponents say it can. Nations could power entire cities. There'd literally be no need for fossil fuels, expensive and short-lived wind turbines.
You'd have to electrify every single vehicle. Not impossible, but it's going to take a complete infrastructural revamp rather than just power generation.
Or even solar panels that degrade over time.
That they do.
Plus, since molten salt reactors don't need water cooling, they could run in deserts, or even space.
Thorium is also common on the moon and easy to find. Here's an actual map of where the lunar thorium is located.
Nice. You can get thorium, and you can also get some helium-3 in the regolith while you're up there, so you can go ahead and have some fusion. Let's go ahead and throw some of that in while we're at it.
Thorium has an electromagnetic signature that makes it easy to find even from a spacecraft. With the
Don't get
energy
me started on helium-3 fusion, by the way.
generated from a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, we can recycle all of the air, water, and waste products within the lunar community. In fact, doing so would be an absolute requirement for success.
Thorium critics
like
say
the
that
way
a
he
lot of the
thinks,
promising
though.
claims are oversimplified, and the road to thorium will be a real long slug. China has made some serious
Maybe I'm one of those people, but I'm going to say, it involves that with any sort of developing new technology. Again, I would still like to see it happen.
moves, but it's still early days. Case in point, the Chinese test reactor is actually tiny, and it's not a full-fledged power plant. It's rated
Oh.
for 2 megawatts of heat. For context, MIT's research reactor on campus, a regular nuclear reactor, although the biggest campus reactor in the US, is 3 times that size.
Research reactors are toys. I essentially played on one as part of getting my my license to operate the big one.
But there's also plans for a 60 megawatt Chinese reactor to be operational by 2030. The Chinese scientists pulled off a world first.
And again, the footage that he's showing are not of thorium reactors. This is also a research reactor that uses uranium fuel.
They added fresh fuel to the thorium reactor while it was running. That proved that continuous operation is possible. And
These are all pulse type reactors that are used in research, mainly because, hey, you pull some control rods and then you have a nice blue prompt critical flash. Prompt critical being safe and controlled in this type of reactor. Do not do that with a commercial reactor, lest you have yourself another Chernobyl. I mean, it's also basically impossible with modern designs, but still.
China may not be alone. Copenhagen Atomics plans to test a molten salt thorium reactor in Switzerland in
I did another video on their stuff. That was interesting.
2026. After this, they plan to mass manufacture them at scale. Other countries are moving, but at a slower pace. India, which has the world's largest thorium reserves, have been researching thorium for ages, but refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that slowed progress. There's multiple startups in the US that are trying to revive the molten salt reactor development, and there's other startups in other countries, but most of this development remains
That's
mostly on
junk
paper.
business.
But even if it is early days, it's encouraging that people are trying. The thorium story shows the power of public research and how past R&D can seed waves of innovation decades later. But it also shows how easily research momentum can stall.
So I'm glad they've kind of introduced the other side of this. This video saying China won the nuclear energy race. If they did, the race wasn't particularly exciting because the race isn't to build a lab scale prototype. It's to 1, commercialize it, 2, regulate it, 3, fuel it and maintain it sustainably for the long term. And 4, if you're looking at it as a thorium versus uranium thing, to outcompete uranium, or at least add as a significant portion of market share, which is going to take mass production of them, massive learning curves, massive upscaling. You're going to need your 3,000, 4,000 megawatt reactors in addition to your small modular reactors using thorium. So nobody, including China, has achieved that. And I still think the closest our civilization has been was during the peak of the Oak Ridge experiments back in the 1960s. After all, that one was bigger. That one was over 7 megawatts thermal, which is still dinky, but a good bit bigger.
As Zhu Hongxie put it, quote, "To achieve something meaningful in this field, you must have perseverance and prepare to dedicate 20 to 30 years to one single pursuit," end quote. So, there's red-hot views on either side of the thorium debate. Is it the clean revolution of the future, or do we cut our potential losses and
No, I want it in there too, but please don't overrate it. Just say what it is.
stick with what we know? That is the question. So I'd love to hear what
Also, people love showing cooling towers. The nuclear plant that I worked at didn't actually have cooling towers. It just had a really, really big reservoir. You don't need cooling towers. You don't necessarily need a reservoir. You can pick one or the other or both, depending on your size and energy demand. They're also not unique to nuclear. I've seen cooling towers for coal and natural gas plants as well.
you guys think. These days, everyone is talking about fake, so I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Well, you've heard my spiel. Thanks so much for the recommendation, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.
The worst-case scenario looms. A full-scale nuclear meltdown.
Nuclear meltdown is actually not the worst case scenario. Today we're going to be looking at another one of Fern's videos. Specifically, the day Fukushima was hit. I only see 3 radioactive symbols despite this being a 6-unit site. Perhaps it's because 3 units were already shut down before the accident. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's see.
It's just another ordinary day for Masao Yoshida. He's a 56-year-old engineer running a nuclear power plant. Like every day, he's assigning tasks, reviewing reports, and making sure everything is running smoothly.
As any other engineering manager would. By the way, 2011, I was still in college at the time.
Little does he know that at this very moment, about 180 kilometers away, events are set in motion that will lead to one of the greatest disasters in the history of Japan. Just offshore, the Earth starts trembling.
This was crazy.
A magnitude 9.
This was crazy, and I actually like the way they said it. The disaster of the earthquake and tsunami was horrific. 20,000 fatalities from the earthquake and tsunami.
Undersea mega-thrust earthquake shakes the region. The Japanese are used to earthquakes, but this one is different.
It's the big one.
It's the most powerful one the country has ever seen. And it will trigger a chain of events that will change the world forever.
Japan has been hit by its biggest earthquake since
an explosion began. Was heard and
interesting animation here, old school looking control room design, because these were older types of boiling water reactors, though not a poor design like Chernobyl. We'll get more on that later.
Seen.
The images of destruction and flooding coming out of Japan are simply heartbreaking.
Well, this is definitely not good news.
This one is a bigger scale than anything this country has ever faced.
There are new fears today that the reactor core being breached.
There are now serious concerns about radioactive material leaks.
Masao Yoshida is in his office when the earthquake strikes. By the time it's over, the entire nuclear plant has lost power. The quake has cut Fukushima Daiichi off from the electrical grid.
This event is what is known as a loss of offsite power. And what happens when you lose offsite power? All of the nuclear reactors would automatically shut down. At this point, all the control rods will safely insert into the reactor fully in a matter of seconds, immediately shutting down the fission reactions. So all the reactors at this point are placed in a safe condition. What happens next is the control room staff for each reactor is going to implement their safe shutdown earthquake procedures. It's basically going to be running through their emergency shutdown procedures to make sure everything shut down properly, all the automatic functions did what they should have done, and to assess the site for damage and implement corrective actions based on the level and extent of the damage.
Although they generate their own electricity, nuclear plants still rely on external power to operate.
The reason why reactors automatically shut down on a loss of offsite power is to minimize the overall amount of heat generated. Even after the reactor is shut down, you're still going to generate decay heat. Now, decay heat's a tiny fraction. We're talking way less than 1% of heat at rated thermal power, but less than 1%, we're still talking several megawatts, but that heat has to be removed using residual heat removal pumps. It's all about conserving energy at this point, because without offsite power, all of the critical systems, such as the residual heat removal system, the emergency core cooling system, in the case of boiling water reactors, they also use something called the reactor cooler isolation cooling system. Now, this is a steam-driven pump, so it doesn't even need power from the emergency diesels, but all of its associated support systems are going to be relying on some form of electricity, whether it be batteries or AC power. So still, your priority at this point is obviously to try to get power back. But without offsite power, the power plant is designed to be okay for a while, for upwards of 7 to 10 days, relying solely on diesel power, but the tsunami hasn't hit yet.
Daiichi has 6 reactor units. Each reactor houses radioactive fuel rods. Nuclear fission generates intense heat that turns water into steam. That steam then drives massive turbines to produce electricity. The fuel rods continue to generate heat even when the reactors are shut down. That's why they need to be cooled at all times.
So decay heat, I say less than 1%. Immediately after shutdown, like 1 second, they're actually supplying about 6 to 7% heat, but that rapidly decays. Something like this. To give you a sense of scale, 1 megawatt is about 1,000 household microwave ovens running. So, tiny amount of heat compared to full power, but not insignificant.
The plant has emergency diesel generators, or EDGs, to keep the water pumps running in case of a power outage. Reactor 1 is an older model that instead uses an isolation condenser to cool the rods. Units 1 to 3,
in addition to the use of diesels, but they're referring to an old form of emergency core cooling system.
Automatically shut down after the earthquake. Units 4 to 6 have already been offline for maintenance.
Yes.
With grid power...
And that's not uncommon. You're going to stagger. You're not going to have planned outages for the entire power station at the same time. But it brings up an interesting point. Unit 1 was a little one. It was only 460 megawatts, so it didn't need as much emergency core cooling because its core was smaller. 2 through 5 were 780, and 6 was 1100. All pretty small as far as nuclear reactors go. The power plant that I worked at, one had 2 units. Each of them were over 3,800.
The backup generators kick in to keep the cooling systems operational. Masao Yoshida immediately evacuates his staff. The plant has a designated emergency...
Yep, you'd be activating your emergency plan. You would evacuate all non-essential personnel, such as people in the office, those types of engineers, save for the ones that were on call in the emergency response organization. But that's going to be one team, and the reason why you have a small number of people is 1, they're dedicated, highly trained, quick to organize, and 2, this emergency is going to be managed around the clock. So some people are going to want to leave so they can go home, get some rest, and be prepared to take the next shift. And now this is all just basic stuff. Having a major disaster is only going to complicate stuff further. The major disaster obviously referring to the earthquake and the tsunami. At this point, the nuclear power plant, so they're in the E-plan, but they're not. None of the really bad stuff has happened yet. Just a loss of offsite power by itself. Yeah, it's going to warrant emergency plan activation in addition to the effects of the earthquake, but right now, the nuclear fuel is safe.
On center with seismic filters to withstand earthquakes. Yoshida and parts of his staff shelter there. Disaster drills are routine, but when a real emergency unfolds, chaos takes over. Now, they need to stay...
There is some added oomph when a real disaster happens, but these operators at this point are well trained. We're not dealing with a Chernobyl-type situation, operationally speaking, both in terms of the skills of the operator or in terms of how much information they were provided versus how much of it was a state secret.
And hope the cooling systems hold. Because if they don't, the worst-case scenario looms. A full-scale nuclear meltdown.
Actually, as much as people have brought this up and everyone fears the meltdown, nuclear meltdown is actually not the worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is a radioactive release, a major radioactive release. A nuclear meltdown can be perfectly contained, and basically you have a 3 Mile Island type event where very little radioactivity was released. But yeah, this one's going to be worse.
The fuel rods could melt into an extremely hot and radioactive mass. That mass could reach temperatures of up to 2,000 degrees Celsius and melt through the reactor pressure vessel. It could leak into the environment and contaminate vast areas, rendering them completely uninhabitable for decades.
No, it's not going to render areas completely uninhabitable. As bad as Chernobyl was, it didn't render the area uninhabitable. It was an evacuation out of an abundance of conservatism, but the Chernobyl area is not uninhabitable. Pripyat's not uninhabitable. The one thing that's really bad about water overheating, though, is zirconium cladding is used in your fuel rods, and it can react with water to produce hydrogen gas. Now, that only happens at high temperatures, like 2,000 degrees. So, yeah. And hydrogen gas can build up and cause explosions.
The heat also builds up immense pressure inside the reactor. If it gets too high, the reactor could explode.
So one important thing to bring up, we're talking about reactor pressure vessel failure, yes, that could happen, but we are still within a reactor containment building. So we're not talking an immediate leak to the environment, even if a reactor pressure vessel were to explode. And containment buildings are designed to withstand the explosion from all of the energy that is trapped within the reactor pressure vessel, plus a conservative safety factor.
At the ERC, Yoshida checks in with other operators across the plant. He's trying to assess the status of the reactors. Everything appears to be stable so far. The backup generators are running. The cooling systems seem to work.
Yeah.
For a brief moment, everyone eases up a bit. But the earthquake was just the beginning. Out on the water, waves start building.
Yep.
They're small at first, but grow larger and more powerful as they approach the coast. Fukushima Daiichi sits right on the shoreline. It's designed to withstand waves up to 6 meters high. But against this monster tsunami, the walls don't stand a chance.
So here's one thing to bring up for added context. A lot of emergency plan drills last about an hour or two. And when you're doing all of your drill response, for those of you who've watched Dragon Ball, it's kind of like the hyperbolic time chamber. An hour in there can feel like 10 hours outside of the simulator. But this is a real event, so that's also a force multiplier for stress. And an hour into it is when the really bad things are starting to happen. The really bad thing didn't happen like within the first 10 minutes. So yes, these crews are going to be fatigued and it's going to get dark.
A wave of almost 15 meters washes over the nuclear plant.
Yeah.
Roads and pathways disappear underwater. Vehicles are swept away like paper boats.
This is far beyond the design basis of the plant. Now, could they have put the diesel somewhere else? Yeah, but they didn't. This plant was designed for 5.7 meters, so little over a third.
People run for their lives, seeking shelter on higher floors. Yeah. About 8 minutes later, a second wave strikes, almost as high as the first. Containment buildings, turbines, offices. The flood just swallows the entire site.
So the flood doesn't breach a containment building, but it can, surround it with water, sure. But the offices, the auxiliary buildings housing the diesels, these electrical switchgear rooms, all that water's horrible for switchgear.
Yoshida monitors the situation from the ERC. A report comes in from the control room in Reactor 1. The tsunami has flooded the diesel generators. The lights are out, and the instrument panels have gone dark. The isolated condenser...
Some of the instrument panels would gone dark. Some of them have battery backups in other locations, but battery backup system isn't for, running your big pumps. It's for providing monitoring and instrumentation controls. You might be able to operate some small DC-powered valves, and the RCIC system would still work because it's a steam-driven pump. But this is where things escalate a lot as far as emergency plan. This is what's known as a station blackout, which is a loss of all AC power. So you have batteries and steam-driven systems is all the operators have. And they're going to be in the dark. They have some battery backed up lights, so they can at least see what's going on in the control room. But batteries are only designed to last 8 hours. And one other thing that operators do is they can do some load shedding for the batteries, because some of them are designed for secondary non-nuclear systems. So they can just shed those loads to try to make the batteries last as long as possible. And there are time-critical operator actions that you do that during this loss of AC power event. But doing it in the dark, in flooding, horrible.
The one has lost signal from the control room and gone into automatic shutdown. Without electricity, the engineers have no idea what's happening inside the reactors. They don't know if a meltdown can still be prevented, or if it's already well underway.
Yeah, you can't see what's going on, but you should still, you're still going to have some instrumentation, but that you can rely on with batteries. And there are estimates you can still make even without indication to determine if fuel damage or core damage has occurred.
Yoshida knows that this situation extends far beyond the power plant itself. He reports to the local and national governments.
That is one thing that a lot of people regarding this event seem to just focus on the nuclear disaster, which compared to 20,000 people losing their lives, there was one fatality at the nuclear plant. There has been some arguments that there are over 2,000 disaster-related deaths that claim to be due to stress associated with Fukushima, but it's difficult to say if that's incremental stress due to the Fukushima site or due to the massive earthquake and tsunami, and if that should be tacked on to those 20,000. But either way, this was a small percentage of the overall impact from the earthquake and tsunami.
Afternoon, a team of engineers tries to restart the isolated condenser to cool reactor 1. But they fail.
It's hard to restart stuff when you're not aware of what's going on and you're relying on battery systems. And I know they're showing this, but depending on where you are, you wouldn't.
While Yoshida and his team are fighting to cool the reactors, the outside world takes stock of the havoc the tsunami wreaked. The waves have inundated large parts of the eastern coastline. Miyagi Prefecture is among the most affected. These are the areas hit by the tsunami. Tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. 100,000 people are forced to evacuate, and about 1 million homes are destroyed. I'm
glad this video is bringing up the overall scope of the disaster rather than just Fukushima.
Region is wrecked. But right now, the world's eyes are fixed on the looming nuclear disaster at Fukushima Daiichi. The workers had to get creative. They hook up car batteries to the instrument panels to restore the lights. Now they can finally read the parameters again and monitor.
You have to use what you have and
the situation. Pressure inside the reactor is rising fast. Without cooling, the intense heat will boil the remaining water into steam and force the pressure even higher.
Yeah, so it's called a boiling water reactor, but it's not supposed to blow when you're shut down. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
There's only one option left to prevent an explosion. Venting.
Yep.
That's a last resort procedure where special valves are opened to release steam and reduce pressure inside the reactor.
Wouldn't say it's a last resort. I mean, a vent is a form of pressure control, and it would be within the containment building.
Venting might prevent an explosion, but it has a price. Radioactive material could be released into the atmosphere, causing extreme levels of contamination.
It could release. I mean, you're essentially removing one fission product barrier, that being the reactor vessel and attached to its associated cooling system. But you don't want it to cause an even bigger breach, a bigger explosion that could potentially challenge your reactor containment building. Because you know how I said that they're designed to withstand explosions? Well, this accident is beyond the design basis because of the severity of this tsunami. So you're working with both the on-site, the control room operators, the reactor operators, as well as the remote emergency response team. They have the off-site emergency director has authority at this point, and because he has a much bigger team of engineers, subject matter experts to help them. So the control room, where they're relying on car batteries, they can't see much of anything, aren't isolated and having to make a decision without any outside help.
Which is why Masao Yoshida considers it.
Because at this point, a lot of their operating procedures aren't going to be terribly useful if a lot of your equipment isn't available.
Last resort. Amidst the chaos, he's in close contact with the Tokyo headquarters of TEPCO, the power company that owns and operates the plant. But communication is difficult.
Yeah.
People at HQ don't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. Yoshida and his team feel abandoned. The water level in Reactor 1 is checked every 15 minutes and manually recorded next to the gauge. It appears to be rising. Maybe the water is not evaporating after all. The staff is relieved.
Or you have a bubble in your reactor vessel, which is causing indication to go up, but you have this massive steam void here that is pushing water up there. Sort of like what happened in 3 Mile Island.
They don't know the gauge is wrong. The worst case scenario at Reactor 1 is already fully underway. The meltdown is happening.
And you could have a scenario where that bubble is pushing water up, so it thinks you're higher, but the fuel rods are already exposed and they're already melting.
Levels on site start spiking on the very first night. Yoshida fears the worst. What if Reactor 1 has a leak and is already releasing radioactive material? He receives new orders from...
Even a breach that's contained within the reactor containment building would still not be insignificant, because again, you're implying fission product barriers are failing at this point.
Go headquarters. The venting process must be started immediately to relieve pressure inside the reactor. But Yoshida has...
That's also how you... One of the potential ways. There are other ways to manage bubble growth in your reactor vessel if you have a steam void, and that's going to be associated with cooling down and depressurizing. But with cooling down out of the picture due to loss of all AC power, as well as the potential failure of your steam-driven systems, yeah, that's a problem.
The plant is still without power, and without it, venting can't be done remotely. The valves have to be opened manually.
Yeah, so some pressure valves are just a spring-loaded thing where it does happen automatically, like a safety valve, and they do have these, but pressure isn't that high yet, and that's to basically prevent catastrophic vessel damage. But there are other relief valves that are motor-operated valves that require electricity to operate, that a control room operator would just turn a switch to open that valve. And motor operator valves can be operated locally and manually, where you by hand declutch a motor and turn the hand wheel, but you really don't want to do that in a radiological, high pressure, high temperature environment.
It means Yoshida has to send his workers into potentially contaminated areas. The radiation there...
Get a brief from radiation protection first. There are some situations where they just straight up won't let you do it.
already be deadly. He faces an impossible choice: defy orders from the top, or risk the lives of his team. The next morning, the government designates an evacuation zone. Residents within a 10-kilometer radius from the plant have to leave their homes.
One of the reasons why this event ultimately did release a lot of radioactive material, but it wasn't even anywhere close to the impact as Chernobyl, was it was near the ocean. And water is great at absorbing radiation, great at absorbing heat, so that's one thing they had going for it, just based on location.
A few hours later, a helicopter touches down on site. It's Japan's Prime Minister, Naoto Kan. He says he wants to assess the situation firsthand, but it soon becomes